Welcome to the video. My name is Oliver King, and this channel is basically a discussion for beginners in regards to photography. And in this video, what I'm just going to be talking about is an introduction to film photography, which is something I just got into over the Christmas break, so I've barely been at this for about 1 month. Lately, I've been a little bit tired looking at screens and the digital photography and spending so much time on my computer, so I thought I would just pick up a camera from Kijiji, and this one was $200. It's the Pentax K1000, which is an awesome beginner camera if you're looking to start film photography. So I just got started with this, and this video is just going to be a discussion of some of the things I learned about this camera, and then just some things in general I learned about film photography. The first thing that I learned about using film was that I'm not a particularly good photographer. And I don't mean that to be critical of myself, but with digital photography, you can hide a lot of the flaws in your own skills. And so with composition in the photos that I took, I noticed that there was a lot of boring shots, honestly. And that's fine. I went out and I shot about 100 pictures, which actually isn't that much, but I got them all developed and I took them home and I've been looking at them. And I like some of them for sure, but composition is king in photography, and not many of them had a whole lot of emotional stirrings to them. So it was really interesting to do the film photography because I really had to, spend the time and look for my locations correctly, but I still found it challenging to create good concepts with my photos. And so, the photos that I did take that I do perceive as being good, there's about 20 of them out of 100, and that's not that many. But I can't hide a lot of the flaws in them. Once you develop them, that's pretty much it. I really like shooting on the Pentax K1000 because it's a great student camera because everything on this is manual. You have to adjust the aperture manually, you have to adjust shutter speed, you have to set your ISO based on your film. So it teaches you a lot of the basics that you already kind of know with digital photography, but it just kind of puts it in a new body and it really changes the perspective you have when you're looking at it. The only thing that's digital on this is that it has a light meter on the inside of it, so you can kind of tell what's exposed properly. I think without that, I'd be completely lost. I also have to remember with this guy that I have to cover the front lens because the light meter runs out if I don't do that. The second thing that I learned about this was all about coloring. And one of the things you can really get away with digital photography is hiding your flaws by putting in some nice colors, changing the saturation, the hue and everything. And rather than doing that with film photography, you really have to rely on your lighting. You really have to rely on your eyes for selecting what's proper color, what's going to actually pop out in a composition. A lot of the things that I shot were a little bit washed out or a little bit, you couldn't tell what the subject was that I was shooting. And that was really interesting to me. I really actually had a lot of fun doing this because the results were kind of poor, but also really teaching. Things like, what is my exposure supposed to be? What's my exact subject? How do these colors match up if I can't fix them later? A lot of the times when you're doing digital photography, you're shooting to edit because you know that you can pull your colors back. You know that, if you have a really high dynamic range shot where you have a lot of contrast, you have a lot of bright things, a lot of dark things, you can fix that later. And, you could pull your highlights down or whatever. But with film photography, it was really a focus on going out and shooting at the correct time of day and also mixing that with just focusing on composition. I usually took about 10 minutes for each of my photos to set it up properly, get the shot that I wanted, and even then, sometimes it just didn't work out. Sometimes my focus was off. My focus was off a lot, and that somewhat surprised me because I thought I was nailing focus, but sometimes it was bang on, other times it just wasn't. That leads me to the third thing that I really learned, which is that with digital photography, you're not always aware of how many mistakes you're making, and you're not really learning from them as quickly as you can with film photography because of the associated cost and the time that goes into it. So it slows everything down in a really pleasant way. You get to be all analog about it, you get to take your time, you get to go through the process of really thinking about your shot. And I was only shooting with a 50mm as well. I think the one thing that I'd like to change next time when I go out is having a better focal length range. I think that would be a little bit more fun. But at the same time, I was just making so many mistakes with it, but I feel like I learned a lot more from those mistakes because they actually cost something. When I got the film roll back, I just sat there and examined all of the shots that I took. I got to separate the good ones from the bad ones, and you could see and I could remember where I was making those mistakes. When I'm shooting digital, a lot of the time the pace is pretty high, and I'm not making as many mistakes because the autofocus is kind of covering up my amateurness. And also, I'm able to cover up a lot of the mistakes later on with the digital editing portion. Like I say, I'm just a beginner, so a lot of the times I'm making kind of flawed images, but a lot of the time you can just cover that up. And it's sort of an artificial cheap victory when you're doing your photography, because the final product isn't really a product of your skill as a photographer. It's just that you're able to cover it up because there's so many options out there for you now. The next thing that I learned that I liked the most about it was just the quality of the colors that I got. I'm going to show you all of the photos that I took, but this one in particular, I really liked it because of the colors that came out of it. And they're just colors that are so natural and nice that were just a product of the light, because I wasn't setting my white balance, I wasn't thinking about, editing later or, setting anything up like that. I was just capturing the color that was there. But the quality of the color from the film is just on a different level than the digital cameras, to be honest. I really like my Sony a7 III, and it's a fantastic camera. But there's something that's just a little bit more drawing in. I don't know how to explain it. It's got just a different quality when I'm looking at the actual film. And it looks much more real. It looks more like, I hesitate to say old-fashioned because it is just an older technology, but at the same time, it's got more character. And the colors are just very true and real, and they're very pleasant to look at. I don't know how else to say it. I've printed a lot of my photos with digital cameras, but the film was just really fun to look at. And you can see the grains because I was using a 400 ISO film and a 200 ISO film, so you could see the grains in it, and it just adds this natural, nice texture to all of your shots. So I really did value that, and the color of it was just, it was just very special. It's just unique. I haven't seen that in any of my shots before. It's just the first time that I've really got this kind of quality of color out of a camera before, and maybe that's, again, I'm still learning about digital photography too, so that might just be a lack in my skill there, but it's just really cool to see that there is that distinction between the film and the digital. This leads me to the camera as well. Using this camera has been super fun. And in the winter, it's really nice too, because when it's really cold out, you don't really want to expose digital cameras to the extreme cold. And in Canada, in Calgary, it gets pretty cold here. So it was nice to use this because everything's mechanical on it. So shooting in the winter is actually a little bit of fun because I just wore gloves, and since you just got to crank the film through it, it's not a problem for shooting in the winter. You just got to focus on shooting. So I think I'm going to shoot a lot more in the winter, especially on those cold days when I otherwise probably wouldn't go out with the digital equipment. I was actually pretty surprised at how well I was able to get some shots. They were pretty tack sharp if I nailed focus. If I didn't nail focus, that was kind of my fault. I don't think it was the camera's fault. But I got some really sharp shots where things were perfectly in focus, and it was just this really nice image. And it was really fun because you have to take your time. You have to set everything up just the way you'd like it. It takes that time for the composition, but then also just to make sure you have a good exposure, and you just have to set the aperture just as you would like it, and just controlling all of your light components on it. I don't know how else to say it, but it's a great teacher. I don't necessarily wish that I had started on a film camera because I think it can be a little bit frustrating if you screw up the exposure for all your shots. But I'm glad that I learned on a digital camera and kind of got a base level of skill. But I think just having the film camera, particularly this Pentax K1000, it's been really awesome because it's just such a good teacher. It really exposes the faults in what you're shooting. It really shows where your strengths are. And at the end of the day, you also walk away with a whole bunch of prints and negatives. So you have actual printed photos of what you've completed. I'm always guilty of just uploading things to Lightroom, and that's where they sit. I don't really share them that much because I'm horrible at social media. But with this, I actually have a pile of photos now that I can look through, and those are really awesome quality memories. So I really did enjoy that. Let me know in the comments if you are doing any film photography, or if you're an experienced person, if you're just a beginner getting into it. I'd like to know what your thoughts are. If you're interested in getting started with film photography at all, I would suggest getting one of the Pentax K1000s. From what I read about it, it is a really good beginner getting into the mix with this sort of a thing, and they're not that expensive either. I thought it'd be really cost prohibitive, but I think you can get them from $150 to $250, and I picked mine up, and the person gave it to me with a whole bunch of lenses. They had kept it clean, and they had resealed everything, so it was a really awesome purchase, so I'm glad I went for it. But yeah, let me know what you think of film photography, and if you were thinking about getting into that because you're sick of being on Zoom and your computer all the time.